the more it means to you sometimes, doesn't it? You never see anyone more covetous than a poor person that wants to have some. I'm serious. There's covetous rich people and there's covetous poor people. And I'll tell you, some people will hold on to their scrap or their garbage or whatever their junk is because it's all they got. You know, I saw yesterday a sign with the man on the side of the road and he said, "I have nothing." I thought, well, at least you don't have to worry about losing anything because you don't have anything. But here's a ratio of 1 to 10. A lady's got 10 pieces of silver and one got lost. Now, if I had 10 pieces of silver, I'd try to keep it. I don't know how she lost her silver, but anyway, if she lost it, then the illustration is, what is she going to do? She's going to take a candle and she's going to sweep the house. The idea is she's going to turn over everything and clean everything until she finds it. And when she finds it, she's going to have a party. She's going to call all her friends and say, "Let's celebrate. I found my piece of silver." If 10 pieces of silver were all she had and she lost one of them, 1/10 of it's a lot. Supposing you had $100,000 and you lost $10,000, many of you probably did in the stock market if you had $100,000. Anyway, many of you may have lost in investments. Many people do. That's a big deal, isn't it? 1 in 10. That's a big ratio. Now we go to a ratio of 2. But I think many times people misunderstand the point or the purpose of the passage on the prodigal son. Let me ask you a question. In the context, what is Jesus talking about? What are these illustrations that Jesus is giving? What is the context in Luke chapter 15? Okay, there he's talking about the lost, the importance of the lost. Being found. He's talking about the importance of being found. I believe he's trying to help people understand God's heart and how much He loves them. Matter of fact, he summarizes the lady who's found her silver and says this. He goes ahead and gives the point in verse 10, and he says, "Likewise I say unto you that there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." God is trying to say, the lost mean much to me, and that's my heart. Now let's get into our story about, and I really want to look at it 2 ways. A lot of people talk about the prodigal son and the good son. Or the people talk about the prodigal son, the good son, and the father. And if you study this passage of Scripture, it's really talking about 2 things. It's talking about this man's son and his attitude toward both of them. This man's son and his attitude toward both. I want to draw a little contrast between the 2 sons, but I want to help you to see that they're both the same. I'm going to draw a little contrast, but I want you to see from the passage of Scripture that both these sons are the same. They just behave differently. Okay? First of all, we see in verse 11, a certain man had 2 sons. By the way, that Jesus doesn't say this is a parable. He says this is an illustration. And so I believe that this would have been something that would have literally happened. It's possible that the disciples would have even been aware of this situation. I don't know, but it's possible that the disciples would have known who Jesus was talking about as he's illustrating this to the Pharisees. You see in chapter 16, I've thrown a lot of information at you, but I really want us to get the text and get the point here. Chapter 16, Jesus stops addressing the Pharisees and scribes and he says to his disciples. And so, but this information is for the Pharisees and scribes, and he's trying to help them to understand the heart of God toward the lost. Trying to help them understand how they should view the lost. And in verse 11, he says, "A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And the Scripture says, and he divided unto them his living." Now I want to point out something to you, and I think that you probably know this or have thought about this, but it's good for us to be aware of. The inheritance here was divided between the 2 sons. And I think that probably from a Jewish perspective, the portion that the elder son would have gotten here would have been a double portion. Usually in Jewish tradition and biblical tradition would be that the eldest son got a double portion. And so he would get a whole... If it was this way, if this man had 5 sons, what this father would do would be to divide everything in half, give half to his eldest son, and then the other 4 would divide the second half. And so there'd be a big advantage of being the eldest son here. Do you see that? If there are only 2 sons, then it would be to divide it in 2/3. And the elder son would get 2/3. The elder son would get 2/3, and the younger son would get 1/3. And so what this young man is content to have, or what he wants, is not an equal portion with his brother. I do not believe that they were equally divided portions. I don't think it was a 50-50 split between the young man and the elder son. Matter of fact, and something else I want to point out here from the passage of Scripture in verse 30 proves this. When the father gave the portions to the sons, the father no longer had anything himself. When the father gave the portions, when he divided them between his sons, he gave his sons everything he had, and he just lived with his elder son as though off of what belonged to his elder son. It would make sense, wouldn't it, that the son who got the greater portion would be the one that would have to honor his father by taking care of him? It would just make sense. And so, matter of fact, and it's interesting also, the location of the father and the elder son when the prodigal son comes back. Where's the father at? He's in his house. Where's the elder son at? He's in the field. He's in the field working, and so he's taking care of what belongs to him. And so the father is now living with his younger son, but what the younger son has in verse 30, he says, all that I have is thine. He says, you got it from me, but everything that I've got, I don't have anything, it's yours. Now think of this too from the elder son's perspective, of course. Then whose fatted calf did they kill?
The younger son.
Yeah, the father is celebrating on the younger son what he feels like is his portion. And so it's like he got his portion, he wasted it, now you're going to spend my portion on him. Well, we can understand this, but I want to point out something here. The Bible doesn't put one son in good light and the other son in bad light. I've heard it preached a lot of ways. I've heard the prodigal son's a bad son and the elder son is a faithful son. I've heard it preached the other way. I've heard it say, well, the prodigal son at the point he was restored was in better shape than the elder son because he didn't love his brother like he should have. And friend, I want to say to you that the passage of Scripture is not presented that way at all. It's presented, there was a man that had two sons. There was a father, and the father had two sons. I want to point out to you just that the difference between the sons was really their perspective on life, and both were wrong. The difference between the two sons was only their perspective on life, and both were wrong. If we were to understand this philosophically, we would say that the younger son was an Epicurean. An Epicurean believes that the end in life is the most pleasure. In other words, you need to enjoy life. I mean, you're only going to live so many days, and then you're going to die, and so just get as much out of life as you can and enjoy yourself. And so pleasure is really the end of life. That's what life's all about, having a good time. And so he was the party guy. Now the younger son, the elder son, was different. He would have been a stoic, and he would have said it's what you leave behind. It's what you leave for a heritage that life's about. It's about taking care of what you have and being as good a person as you can be and doing as good a job as you can do and then being faithful with what you have. And that's what life's all about. And I have to say to you that both of those principles are self-serving. It's self-serving to be an Epicurean, my friend, or a person who lives for pleasure. And it's self-serving to live so that you can leave a heritage because it's about you. And both of these sons, in receiving their inheritance, are just as much wrong in their worldview as each other. The prodigal son wasn't more right than the elder. The younger son wasn't more right than the elder. And the elder son wasn't more correct than the younger. We see both of them were wrong about what they thought life was about. And in the end, we see they both get right. So let's just go ahead and let's work our way through so we can get there and learn what Jesus was trying to teach about the importance of the lost. First of all, the younger son says to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. Now, I've heard it preached, well, this young man was he was greedy and he wanted his things now, and so he was impatient. And his problem was he was impatient. He didn't want to wait. He didn't want to have the inheritance when his father died. He wanted it right now. I have to say, the Bible doesn't comment about that. Jesus doesn't offer his opinion about whether it's good to give your child an inheritance before your death or afterward. We just see that this father, who was a good father, by the way, gave his children both an inheritance while he was living. The Scripture doesn't comment about it. I don't think that there's... The point of the passage of Scripture here isn't that it was wrong for the sons to receive their inheritance early. Do you see that? And it wasn't unfair for them to receive their inheritance early because both of them received their fair inheritance. There was no dispute about the inheritance. The younger son received his portion. The elder son received his portion. They both had their inheritance at the same time. And so we're relating this material. Jesus is relating this material. And I don't think this is the point because he tells what his point was, and it wasn't this. So if you want to preach something in it, and it's really not what the Scripture is talking about. It has nothing to do with this man being impatient and wanting his inheritance now. It was the father's decision or his agreement as a good father to give his children their inheritance. Now, where we see the difference between the two sons is what they did with it. Here's what this young son does with it. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together. And so it's probably assets that the father gives his son. It's probably cattle. It's perhaps land. It's perhaps resources, servants. So It's something that had to be liquidated in a